John Brown was an interesting figure. He was such an extreme abolitionist that he considered it a good idea to lead 20 dudes to raid an armory, to provide weapons to slaves, to lead a rebellion across the South, ending slavery. Of course, this venture would fail, and he would be hung as a traitor to the US government. Still, his radical actions further divided the nation, leading into the 1860 election that would mark the prelude to the Civil War. This leads us to today's interesting, but obviously extremely unrealistic, alternate history question. What if John Brown became president? What if this man, so hateful about slavery, somehow became the commander-in-chief in 1861 as the Civil War began? Now normally, I would have a bit of a section here on how could this happen. But let's be honest, it wouldn't and it couldn't. Surprisingly, the crazy lunatic had no actual decent path to political power. But, for the sake of this scenario, let's assume that John Brown is a successful businessman, transitioning into politics as one of the more radical abolitionist voices of the North. During Bleeding Kansas, where Americans fought each other over the state's future as a free or a slave state, Brown rose to national prominence. His sons would be involved and die in the fighting, leading the Brown family to be famed as the heroes of the common Northerners, while Brown himself becomes a populist, using emotional appeals to rile the North up against slavery. Not just speaking out against its injustices, but also focusing on the threat it poses to the welfare of the common American, who are getting outcompeted by free labor. Brown's charismatic demeanor and abstinence from substances like alcohol make him a popular Republican figure. This leads us to the National Republican Convention of 1860, deciding which candidate would lead the party. 4 major candidates emerge: Seward, a staunch abolitionist; Lincoln, the runner-up moderate; Chase, another strong abolitionist; and finally, the extremely radical John Brown. Now, for the sake of this scenario, and no, this would under no circumstances ever happen, let's assume that the convention deadlocks between Seward and Lincoln. Chase decides to endorse Brown, and Seward, in order to prevent Lincoln from winning, also endorses Brown. Somehow, Brown has become the Republican nominee. So, we get to the election, and Brown gets completely destroyed. Despite a 3-way split in the Democratic Party, Brown is just too radical, and even most in the North don't even consider voting for him. Him steamrolling the election like Lincoln did just doesn't happen. But nobody else got the majority either, sending the election to the House of Representatives. Here too, the Republicans are far from guaranteed to win. But again, for the sake of the scenario, let's assume that the split in the Democratic Party fails to be mended, and the House swears in John Brown as the next president. Once more, I will underline just how impossible this is, but we can now dive into the scenario. After Brown's victory in such a manner, the nation is shocked. Not only is an extremely radical figure elected to power, it was done in a way where he didn't win the electoral vote, didn't win the popular vote, and it took many rounds of House voting before they finally chose him. This election would be seen by many as a total joke, and Brown's legitimacy is destroyed from the start. Like in our timeline, many states would secede before Brown ever takes office, and even the border states of our timeline seriously consider seceding. But, purely, Brown's inaugural speech will calm tensions. My fellow countrymen, today we stand at a crossroad. Not every one of you voted for me, but I speak for all of you when I say that I have been chosen by God for a singular task: the destruction of the vile institution of slavery. The Southern aristocrats have held their claws in the American political system for far too long. It is not the will of the South to consider slavery, nor of the Southern people. It is the will of their corrupt elites, the plantation owners. They continue the vile institution, and may I remind you, are not all men created equal. In this way, they also keep the common Northerner down. How much of the nation's farmland have they occupied? How much do they keep your wages down via unfair competition? If it were not I, but Breckenridge here today, he would speak of his monumental victory, of his desire to spread the peculiar institution across the nation. No, slavery cannot be allowed to continue, and any secession is unconstitutional and will be met with swift and full retribution. This is not a struggle against the South. It is a struggle for the South. Together, we shall liberate the common Southerner and slaves alike. Together, we will restore the ideals of our sacred nation. This is our opportunity to take down the aristocrats, down with slavery. Well, alright then. So Brown has not picked the road of caution. We could have probably seen this coming, declaring war on the South on his very first day. Let's see how this might change the timeline. So this map shows the battle lines of our timeline, with these states being the border states. They were slave states, but they stuck with the Union nonetheless. Some out of choice, some by force. Lincoln had a common saying, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Lincoln understood the disaster that losing these states would be in terms of combat and especially supply, as key railways ran through them. To ensure their loyalty, Lincoln did not abolish slavery on day one, instead appeasing those states. While in others, like Maryland, the state government had preemptively been arrested to ensure their loyalty. Now these four states can very easily decide the fate of the war. Missouri and Kentucky for military purposes, while Maryland and Delaware switching sides makes Washington DC surrounded and ready for capture, which would be a major blow to the Union. But Brown is not Lincoln. Where you can criticize Lincoln for perhaps being too careful, Brown has made the war over slavery before it was even officially a war. While noble, this would very likely cause Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky to switch over to the Confederates before the first shot was even fired. Now, the Union is in quite a pickle. When war breaks out, the capital is swiftly occupied, or at least, the government has to hastily flee to Pennsylvania. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. Keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But then, it gets worse. Brown attempts to rally the North, but finds himself unsuccessful. He is seen as an illegitimate president. By many, he would even be seen as the one who caused this split in the nation. Draft dodging and low enthusiasm for the war was already rampant in our timeline, let alone in this one. I can easily see northern state militias just refusing to listen to Brown's government, doing nothing but defend their own state. If the Confederates are any smart, they take very few offensive actions after the fall of Washington. Brown's final hope is something like the Emancipation Declaration, hoping to draft freedmen as soldiers while stirring up rebellions in the South. This, however, does little to immediately change the course of the conflict. Within a month of taking office, Brown has practically lost the Civil War. I would be extremely surprised if he actually got to serve anywhere close to 4 years. He would be impeached as his vice president takes over and is forced to negotiate a peace deal with the South. Considering their strong position, they might even refuse to return Washington, D.C. to the Union, while seizing Kansas and the Southwestern Territories too, leaving the Union defeated and broken. There is no doubt about it. Brown is remembered as the worst president in US history. His brash actions, his uncompromising nature have destroyed the Union. Would the North be able to reclaim the South later? Maybe. But the South is significantly stronger than in most Confederate victory scenarios, and the North a lot weaker. The longer that the nation spent apart, the less likely it becomes. A war of reconquest would be costly, while this alternate US is far less unified, with a weaker central government. With the new North lacking any strategic depth, a couple major southern pushes could cut the nation in half, making war a very tough sell to the northern population. In trying to eradicate slavery, Brown has accidentally allowed the creation of a nation whose only purpose is protecting it. He lives out the rest of his days depressed, or he might even try, in a final hurrah, to rally a slave rebellion anyways, dying at the hands of Confederate militiamen. Alright, so that is extremely depressive. As a palate cleanser, let's end the video with another scenario, which is also very unrealistic. Let's assume that Brown, somehow, manages to keep the nation together at the start, and leads the war in a mostly competent manner. Upon taking office, he practically takes the state governments of border states hostage, waiting just long enough with his more extreme policies to make a war possible. Now, Brown still faces a lot of issues with getting the North mobilized and enthusiastic for war, but Brown has one major advantage over Lincoln. He would be willing to employ freedmen into the war immediately, while encouraging potentially devastating slave revolts. Brown's war conduct is extreme from the start, exterminating slavery wherever Union forces advance, mostly along the Mississippi. Plantations are burned, slave owners are disowned or worse. As the Union marches south, slowly but devastatingly, the South only has one hope: wait for the 1864 election and hope that this madman is voted out of office. Now, the Republican Party would attempt to moderate the president during his term, but they would stand by him during it. His controversy, though, would very much be noted. The North would become extremely unenthusiastic about the conflict. Internationally, though, Brown's actions have ensured that no European state dares intervene. He is radical, but his strong anti-slavery stance makes him popular with the populations of France and Britain. The general war plan is similar to that of our timeline, but Union generals and soldiers have the explicit order to arrest slaveholders, set their slaves free, recruit the willing, or even give them guns and supplies to have them fight a guerrilla conflict. The war is significantly more brutal, with terrible massacres on both sides. Brown has no desire to ever reconcile with the South. In his mind, their spirit and way of life is to be destroyed. This means two things. Casualties are significantly higher, but also the North might make progress faster with their brash tactics. Rather than sit in Washington, Brown would attempt to join the fighting himself, something encouraged by the Republicans, as Brown's cabinet handles most of the governing of the state. Now, despite Brown's successes, he would be too unpopular and controversial, and as the 1864 election approaches, the Republicans remove him from the ticket, quite possibly landing on Lincoln as the moderate figure to succeed him. His platform could underpin, Brown was the radical needed to fight the war, I am the moderate needed to end it. Lincoln's platform of unity and reconciliation could prove very popular to such a war-torn nation. Now, assuming that Lincoln still wins this election, he is in quite a bind after victory. He can hardly promise amnesty to all Confederate leaders like he did in our timeline, with Brown having forced through orders to have all of them trialed as traitors, and many landowners have already been disowned or worse. While Lincoln still tries his best to reconcile, the South, overall, gets treated far harsher than in our timeline when the war does eventually conclude. Similarly, the Reconstruction effort is far more thorough than in our timeline. Seized agricultural lands by Brown are divided amongst freed slaves, which would centralize their population more strongly amongst the Mississippi, where the Union advanced first. Lincoln is likely never assassinated, though Brown very well could be, allowing Lincoln to remain in office until 1872. What happens after he departs is impossible to say, and will greatly depend on who takes power after, and there is no guarantee that things like the Crow Laws or similar power grabs by the southern white population are prevented. Yet, Reconstruction has gone further. The freed slaves have a much better position in Southern society, and taking this away will be far more difficult. Lincoln would generally be seen as one of the best presidents in US history. His predecessor, Brown, not so much. Even amongst the people sympathetic to his cause, most likely think that he had gone too far. For Brown, the goal justified every mean, which would set a very dangerous precedent within US politics. However you slice it, Brown would easily be the president responsible for the most American deaths. Within later media, a very common question becomes, what if Lincoln had won the 1860 election? His actions as president between 1864 and 1872 leads many to paint this as a glorious timeline, where Lincoln prevents the Civil War from breaking out altogether, as it becomes commonly debated whether the slave states wanted to secede or if Brown's radical opinions and disputed election results forced their hands. Lincoln's presidency in such alternate histories would be painted as a time of peace, where within normal political frameworks, the power of slavery would be slowly weakened. So that's my take on this frankly insane timeline. And I will again remind you, there is no way in hell that any of this ever comes even close to happening. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.